I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something hauntingly beautiful about them. How time stood still, how nature crept in through shattered windows and broken walls. Each ruin had a story, and I loved discovering them. That's why I was here. The house stood deep in the forest, hidden from the world, its once grand frame now sagging with decay. I had read about it in an old forum post, a mansion no one dared to enter. Some said people who went inside never came out. Others claimed a shadow lived there, waiting for those who disturbed it. Most would have turned away. But not me. Sunlight streamed through the trees as I stepped onto the rotting porch. The door, slightly ajar, let out a long, weary creak as I pushed it open. Inside, dust hung in the air, dancing in the afternoon light that filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The silence was overwhelming. No birds, no wind, just stillness. As I stepped inside, I felt a strange mix of unease and fascination. The remnants of the past were everywhere. Faded wallpaper peeling in long strips, broken furniture covered in dust, a grand staircase that once must have been stunning but now sagged with neglect. I ran my fingers along an old wooden table, feeling the rough texture of time. I imagined the house in its prime, laughter echoing through the halls, footsteps moving up and down the grand staircase, light spilling through crystal chandeliers. Now it was just a shell of what it had been. I took a cautious step forward. The wooden floor groaned beneath my weight. Then, another creak. I froze. It had come from deeper inside the house. I turned my head slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Shadows stretched long across the floor, twisting into the corners of the room. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. But then, the air shifted. A strange, almost imperceptible change in pressure. Like the house itself was exhaling. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and an unfamiliar heaviness settled in my chest. The silence deepened, pressing in on me, and then, thump. A sound from upstairs. Thump. Thump. Heavy footsteps coming down. My breath caught in my throat. The house felt smaller, suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. I bolted into the nearest room, a ruined living area, its furniture rotting, glass shattered across the floor. I dropped behind an old couch, pressing my back against the damp wood, forcing myself to stay silent. A shadow stepped inside. But it wasn't just any shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a form that shifted like smoke or liquid darkness. Its edges were jagged, unnatural, as though it was fighting to keep its shape. But what caught my breath and locked it in my chest were its heads. There were two heads, both perched atop the same body, twisted and distorted. Each head was a mass of darkness, their faces barely visible beneath layers of shadow. But it was the mouths that haunted me. Both heads had rows of long white teeth, fang-like and jagged, sharp as knives. They glinted in the dim light, dripping with something dark and viscous. The sight was enough to make my heart skip a beat. Around the figure, a dark smoke swirled, like a cloud of ink seeping from the very fabric of the house. It clung to the floor, to the walls, choking the air. The figure moved closer. It was listening, searching. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath shallow. The room felt darker, like the daylight outside couldn't reach me anymore. I could hear it breathing, a low, raspy sound, like dead leaves shifting in the wind. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. For what felt like an eternity, it stood there. And then, the figure turned and slowly walked out of the room, its dark smoke trailing behind it. The room felt lighter, but the tension remained. I could still feel the presence lingering in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve screaming for me to run, but I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't just charge out the room like I wanted. The shadow might be waiting for me to make a mistake. I crept toward the doorway, staying low to the ground, the hairs on my neck prickling with every sound. My footsteps were muffled by the heavy dust on the floor, but I moved cautiously, inching my way down the hall. The front door was still ajar, just a few steps ahead. I pressed on, each movement deliberate, the silence hanging like a heavy blanket over the house. When I reached the main entryway, my heart raced. The door was within arm's reach. I took a breath, the last shred of fear still clinging to me, and then I stepped outside, slowly, cautiously. The moment my feet hit the ground, I didn't hesitate. My instinct screamed at me to run. I broke into a sprint, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I ran down the overgrown path through the forest, my only thought being to get away, to escape. I reached the main road in what felt like seconds, the distance between me and the house growing wider with every step. I spotted my car in the distance, parked just beyond the tree line. I didn't look back as I jumped into the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, I threw the car into gear and sped away, tires screeching against the gravel. I didn't stop until the forest was nothing more than a blur in my rearview mirror. But as the miles passed, and the forest faded from sight, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had crossed that threshold before me. How many had felt that same weight, that same chilling presence, and never made it out. The thought gnawed at me, a sickening truth that twisted my stomach. And somewhere deep inside, I knew it would always be there, in that house, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake I had.
I moved into the building 6 months ago. It was nothing special, just an old brick apartment complex with creaky floors and thin walls. The kind of place where you hear muffled conversations through the vents and the pipes groan late at night. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. Every morning, as I left for work, I developed an odd little routine. The old woman in 3B would be sitting at her window, peering out at the street below. She always wore the same thing, a faded blue cardigan and round glasses that made her eyes look too large for her face. Her hair, wispy and white, was usually pinned back. She would always wave at me. At first, I waved back out of politeness. Just a quick flick of the wrist before I headed to the bus stop. But as time passed, it became a habit. Some days, I even looked forward to it. Her small wave, the faintest hint of a smile. We never spoke. I didn't even know her name. Then, one morning, everything changed. I stepped outside, bag slung over my shoulder, and glanced up as usual. But this time, she didn't wave. She was sitting in her usual spot by the window, but she wasn't moving. She just stared. Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, her face expressionless. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Maybe she wasn't feeling well? Maybe she didn't recognize me? I gave a small, awkward wave anyway. Nothing. A shiver crept up my spine. I turned away, forcing myself to dismiss the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. But as I walked toward the bus stop, I had the strongest sensation that she was still watching me. That afternoon, I ran into my landlord in the hallway, a middle-aged guy with tired eyes and a tendency to overcharge for everything. I mentioned the woman in 3B, describing her as best I could. His brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The woman in 3B, the one at the window every morning," I said. He stared at me, confused. "No one lives in 3B. I laughed, thinking he was joking. "Come on. The old lady with the white hair, she waves at me all the time." His face darkened. "That sounds like Mrs. Dawson." He hesitated. She lived there for years, but she passed away last fall. I felt the blood drain from my face. No, I said, shaking my head. That's impossible. I see her every morning. The landlord's expression was serious now. Apartment 3B has been empty since she died. No one's been in there. Not legally, anyway. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. My mouth was dry. My thoughts tangled together. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in my apartment felt louder. Every shadow seemed longer. The next morning, I hesitated before stepping outside. A part of me didn't want to look, but I did. I don't know why. I just did. And there she was, sitting at the window.
The steady beeping of the heart monitor and the quiet hum of the machines were the only sounds in my hospital room as I drifted in and out of a restless sleep. The surgery had been long and complicated, and though the worst was over, my body ached with a deep, dull pain. The medication helped, but it also left me groggy, tangled somewhere between wakefulness and dreams. I wasn't sure what time it was when I stirred in my hospital bed, my throat dry and my limbs heavy. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the hallway light seeping in through the slightly open door. As my eyes adjusted, I became aware of a figure standing quietly beside my bed. She was a nurse, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, nothing like the scrubs the modern nurses wore. Her crisp white dress fell just below her knees, and a small cap rested neatly on her dark, neatly pinned hair. There was something about her presence that was instantly comforting. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice warm and reassuring. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. As if anticipating my need, she reached for a cup of water and guided a straw to my lips. The cool liquid soothed my parched throat, and I managed a whisper of thanks. She smiled gently. "You're healing well," she said, adjusting the sheets around me with careful hands. "Try to rest." There was something calming about her. Her touch was light, yet firm, and her presence felt safe, almost motherly. As she checked my IV and gently smoothed my pillow, I felt my heavy eyelids begin to close again. Before I drifted off, I managed to ask, "What's your name?" She hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Margaret." Then sleep took me. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large window, painting the sterile white walls with a soft golden glow. I felt a little stronger, though still sore. The night felt almost like a dream, but the memory of Nurse Margaret's kindness lingered vividly. When the morning nurse came in to check my vitals, I decided to ask about her. "The nurse last night, Margaret," I said, my voice still hoarse from disuse. "She was here in the middle of the night. She checked on me." The nurse furrowed her brow. "Margaret?" she repeated, clearly puzzled. "Yes, she was wearing an old-fashioned uniform. She gave me water and fixed my sheets." The confusion in the nurse's eyes deepened. "I don't know of any Margaret on staff," she said, flipping through the patient log. "And, no one checked in on you overnight besides the usual rounds. I was on shift." A strange chill passed over me. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Positive." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't delirious, was I? The memory of Margaret's presence was too clear, too real to have been a dream. But there was no logical explanation. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when a different nurse came to deliver my medication, that I decided to ask again. "I had a nurse named Margaret take care of me last night," I said carefully. "But no one seems to know who she is." The nurse, a woman in her 50s with graying blonde hair, froze. Her expression shifted from polite professionalism to something unreadable. "Margaret," she murmured almost to herself. She hesitated, then looked at me closely. What did she look like? I described her, the neat white dress, the dark hair, the gentle smile. With each detail, the nurse's face paled slightly. After a long silence, she exhaled and said, "There used to be a nurse here named Margaret. She worked in this hospital decades ago, back when nurses still wore uniforms like the one you described." She swallowed. "She passed away a long time ago, during a surgery. A surgery similar to yours." A shiver ran down my spine. "What?" "She was one of the most caring nurses here," the woman continued. "She looked after her patients as if they were family. People used to say that even after her death, she never really left the hospital." The room felt suddenly colder. My mind raced. Had I really been visited by a ghost? And yet, the memory of her kindness, of her touch, was so real. It wasn't frightening. If anything, it was reassuring. "She still looks after patients," I murmured. The nurse smiled faintly, though her eyes were still full of wonder. "Yes," she said softly. "I suppose she does." I looked down at my hands, remembering the gentle way Margaret had tucked the blankets around me, the way she had whispered for me to rest. And for the first time since my surgery, I truly felt at peace.
When my husband and I moved into this house, we were thrilled. It was an old colonial-style home with plenty of space for our little family. The moment I stepped into what would become my daughter's bedroom, something felt off. It was subtle, just a faint pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled in my chest. But I brushed it aside. New homes, even old ones, take time to get used to. 3 months passed and life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Our 6-year-old daughter, Emily, seemed to love her new room. She would spend hours playing, sometimes giggling at nothing. I figured it was normal. Kids had vivid imaginations. But then she started talking to someone. At first, it was harmless. I'd walk by her room and hear her murmuring softly. When I asked who she was talking to, she simply said, "Mr. Tall." "Who's Mr. Tall?" I asked. "He's my friend," she said with a shy smile. I assumed it was an imaginary friend, which wasn't unusual for kids her age. But the way she talked about him unsettled me. "He's very tall," she said one evening while I was tucking her into bed. "He touches the ceiling." That sent a shiver down my spine. Something about it just felt wrong. "Does he live here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Emily nodded. "Yes, he says this is his house." I laughed nervously. "Well, it's our house now." She frowned, looking at the corner of the room. "Mr. Tall says it's still his." A cold chill crawled up my arms, but I didn't want to scare her, so I kissed her forehead and told her to go to sleep. That night, I dreamed of shadows stretching across the walls, of something lurking just beyond my sight. When I woke up, my heart was pounding, though I couldn't remember why. It wasn't until a few nights later that things escalated. I was lying in bed when I heard whispering. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then I realized it was coming from Emily's room. I sat up, listening carefully. A pause. Then, in a hushed voice, I heard Emily say, "Okay, I'll ask." I frowned and got out of bed, my feet silent against the hardwood floor as I walked to her room. I pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. Emily was sitting up in bed, looking straight at me. Her face was calm, but her eyes were serious. "Mommy," she said softly, "Mr. Tall wants to know why you're sleeping in his room." I froze. His room. My throat was dry. Emily nodded, then glanced at the far corner of the room. Her expression changed, her brows furrowed as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. After a few moments, she whispered, "Mr. Tall says it used to be his." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I followed her gaze but saw nothing, just an empty corner. But I felt something, a presence. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, wrong. I forced a smile and walked over to her bed. "Sweetie, no one else is here," I whispered, brushing her hair back. "It's just us." She hesitated, then whispered back, "He doesn't like when you say that." My body went rigid. A part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself she was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. We were not alone. The next morning, I told my husband about what happened. He chuckled at first, but when he saw how shaken I was, his smile faded. "Maybe she just overheard something," he said. "Overheard what? We don't even know the history of this place," I shot back. That was when I decided to do some digging. I spent the afternoon researching the house's history. It took some time, but eventually I found something. A name buried in old property records. The house had once belonged to a man named Victor Langley. He had lived here with his daughter for many years, until she passed away from a serious illness. Stricken with grief, he remained in the house alone, consumed by loneliness and the loss of her. Eventually, unable to bear the emptiness, he took his own life. His sudden disappearance went unnoticed for some time, and soon after, the house was abandoned. His nickname? Mr. Tall. My skin prickled. I scrolled further. There was a single grainy photo attached to an old newspaper clipping. It showed a man standing in front of the house. He was thin, gaunt, and disturbingly tall. I slammed my laptop shut. That night, I moved Emily into our room, and when I went back to her room to grab some of her things, I didn't dare look at the corner. Because I knew, somewhere in the shadows, he was watching. We didn't go back into Emily's room that night. I told myself it was just a precaution, that I was being irrational, letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was in that room, and it knew I had seen it. Emily, however, didn't seem to share my unease. She didn't complain or whimper in fear when I set up a small bed for her in our room, but she did look confused. "Why can't I sleep in my room, Mommy?" she asked, tilting her head. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I just think it'd be fun to have a sleepover in here for a little while." She considered this, then shrugged. "Okay." That was it. No fear, no concern. She just curled up under the blanket, content. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us leave that room. Watching. And waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old house made my pulse jump. My husband, Mark, slept soundly beside me, unaware of the growing dread pressing down on me like a weight. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound, a faint rhythmic scratching. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was silent except for Mark's steady breathing and the hum of the heater kicking on. But then, there it was again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The noise was coming from down the hall, from Emily's room. I swallowed hard. My first instinct was to wake Mark, but something told me not to. Some primal part of me whispered that if I acknowledged it, if I spoke of it aloud, it would get worse. I hesitated, then slowly slid out of bed. The floor was cold beneath my feet as I crept toward the hallway. The door to Emily's room was open just a crack. I reached out with trembling fingers and pushed it wider. The room was empty. The soft glow of the nightlight cast shadows along the walls, stretching them unnaturally. I stepped inside, my breath shallow. Then I saw it. Emily's heart-shaped plush sat in the middle of the room. It shouldn't have been there. When I tucked her in earlier that night, she'd been curled up with it, holding it close like she always did. She never slept without it. but now it was sitting upright, perfectly placed, as if someone had set it there on purpose. My stomach twisted. I took a slow, careful step forward. The air felt off, thick and heavy, as if I had just stepped into a space that someone else had only recently left. The plush looked so small, so deliberate, sitting in the empty room. I bent down and picked it up. The fabric was unnaturally cold, as though it had been sitting alone in the dark for hours. A sharp prickle of unease ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I slowly turned and walked out of the room, my heart racing. I headed straight for our bedroom, where Mark and Emily were both asleep. I closed the door quietly behind me, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that followed me. The next morning, Emily was as cheerful as ever, completely unfazed by the fact that she had spent the night in our room. If anything, she seemed more confused by my reaction than by the change in routine. "When can I sleep in my room again?" she asked over breakfast, swinging her legs under the chair. I hesitated. "We'll see, sweetheart. Maybe in a few nights." She frowned. "Why?" I glanced at Mark, who was reading something on his phone, completely detached from the conversation. I knew he thought I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, horribly wrong. Out of nowhere, Emily spoke up, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, Mr. Tall said you're worried, but you don't need to be." "You talked to him last night?" She nodded, taking another bite of cereal. "Yeah, he was just wondering why I wasn't in my room." I swallowed. "And what did you say?" Emily shrugged. "I told him I didn't know, that maybe you just like having me close." She smiled like it was the most ordinary conversation in the world. I forced a chuckle. "I do like having you close." She grinned, swinging her feet under the table. "Mr. Tall said he understands. He remembers what it was like to take care of someone." A cold shiver ran through me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, my voice quiet, trying to keep the unease from seeping through. Emily paused, her little brow furrowing as she thought. She took another bite of her cereal, then looked up at me, her expression innocent. "He said he understands why you're worried. He says you're just trying to protect me." I swallowed, my mind racing. "And what else?" She shrugged, her small shoulders lifting as she settled back into her chair. "He said he's been alone for a long time, that he used to take care of his daughter, but she's not here anymore." A shiver ran down my spine. Emily's eyes darkened for just a moment, but then she smiled as if the memory didn't faze her. "He doesn't like talking about it, but he said that's why he stays, to make sure I'm safe, so no one's alone." The words wrapped around me like a cold fog, but I held on to them, trying to make sense of them. "He wants to take care of you?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She nodded, her little voice soft and serious. "Yeah, he says that's why he likes to watch over me. He says he feels better when I'm not scared." I exhaled slowly, my thoughts swirling. It was strange, but there was something almost comforting in what Emily was saying. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded like Mr. Tall genuinely cared, like he wanted to protect her the way he had once protected his own daughter. I reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emily's face, trying to smile. "And what else did Mr. Tall say?" Emily's eyes sparkled as she recalled the conversation. "He said I shouldn't worry about anything. He'll make sure nothing bad happens." A small part of me wanted to believe it, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Even though Mr. Tall seemed kind, even though his intentions seemed good, I couldn't ignore the heaviness that had settled in the air ever since Emily first mentioned him. I forced another smile. "That's very nice of him." She nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, Mr. Tall is nice. He just wants to make sure no one is alone. He says that's what he does. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, unsure whether I should feel comforted or wary. But one thing was certain. Mr. Tall wasn't here to harm us. He was here to care for us in the way he knew best. And that realization was both a blessing and a curse.
It started with a flash in the sky. A bright blue streak that cut through the night like a comet. Only it wasn't a comet. It wasn't anything I could recognize, and it certainly wasn't anything from Earth. I've always been skeptical of UFOs and aliens, mostly dismissing them as myths or exaggerations. But that night, everything changed. I'll never forget it. I was out on the back porch of my cabin, just off the grid in the mountains, near the edges of the national forest. The stars were usually incredible up there, like something out of a dream. No city lights, no distractions. It was quiet, peaceful. I'd spent a lot of nights like this, sitting alone, just thinking. But that night something felt off. I noticed the flash first. It was bright, almost blinding, but it didn't hurt my eyes. It was almost as though it didn't belong in our atmosphere. I froze for a moment, heart pounding, watching as the light streaked across the sky, heading toward the forest. It disappeared over the tree line, but the silence that followed was unnerving. No usual night sounds, no rustling in the trees. I grabbed my jacket and stepped off the porch, instinctively heading toward the forest. My breath was coming faster now, though I couldn't explain why. Curiosity? Fear? Both? I wasn't thinking clearly. My feet carried me deeper into the woods, the dark trees casting long shadows across my path. The night was cold, and the air had that strange static buzz you feel before a storm, though the sky above was clear. Then I heard it. A hum. Low at first, almost imperceptible, like the background noise of a distant engine, but as I continued walking, the sound grew louder. It felt like it was vibrating through my bones. I stopped when I reached the edge of a small clearing, hidden by a thick cluster of pines. Through the gaps in the trees, I saw it, a soft, pulsing blue glow. It illuminated the entire area with an eerie, gentle light. The glow wasn't harsh or glaring, but it wasn't natural either. My heart thudded in my chest as I crouched behind a tree, pressing myself against the bark, trying to stay as silent as possible. The glow was coming from something just ahead. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. Something unnatural, something alive. My pulse raced as the hum grew louder. Then they appeared. 3 figures emerged from the glowing light, gliding through the air with a grace that made no sense. They didn't walk. They floated, their feet never touching the ground. I couldn't make out their faces, only vague shapes wrapped in flowing, silvery fabric. The light from the ship reflected off them, creating a shimmering halo around their forms. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. I wanted to turn and run, but my body wouldn't move. I could only watch, hidden behind the tree, frozen with fear and wonder. The figures seemed to be studying the forest around them. One of them raised a long, slender arm and pointed toward the trees, its hand glowing faintly as if it were scanning them. Another figure knelt by a pile of rocks, inspecting them with delicate motions, as if trying to understand something about their composition. I watched, my mind racing to make sense of it all. They were observing, analyzing the environment, our world. One of them, tall, over 7 feet, hovered near a cluster of pine trees, its body rippling with light, the silvery fabric flowing around it like liquid metal. It seemed to be studying the trees, its hands moving slowly, almost reverently, across the bark, as if it could sense something hidden there. Its eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, remained hidden in the shadows of its hood, but I could feel its gaze. I didn't dare make a sound. The third figure, shorter than the others, stood in the center of the clearing. It raised its hand toward the sky, and the light around it pulsed, illuminating the scene in a soft rhythmic glow. The entire clearing seemed to hum in response, as if the air itself were vibrating with energy. The figure slowly turned its head, scanning the surrounding forest with a deep, intense focus, almost as though it were learning everything it could about this place. For a long moment I thought about moving, about retreating further into the woods, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. What were they doing here? Why had they come? The figures lingered in the clearing, their glowing bodies moving slowly, methodically, as if cataloging everything around them. The stones, the trees, the air itself. They didn't seem to notice me hiding behind the tree, their attention fully on their work. The hum grew louder, and the tall figure, the one who had been near the trees, turned slowly, gliding back toward the craft. The others followed, their movements fluid and deliberate. They didn't hurry. They moved as if time itself bent around them. As they approached the glowing ship, the light around them seemed to pulse in response, like the craft was drawing them in. The hum intensified, vibrating through the air, and for a brief moment, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a quiet, almost imperceptible movement, the ship began to lift off the ground, its glow slowly fading as it ascended, disappearing into the night. I stayed hidden, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. The silence that followed was crushing. I waited, frozen, for what felt like hours before I dared to move. When I finally stood up, my legs were shaking. I glanced around the clearing, the air heavy with silence. The only trace of what had happened was the faint fading glow still lingering in the air, like an echo of their presence. I returned to the cabin, my mind reeling. I couldn't fully understand what I had witnessed. It felt unreal, yet I knew it had happened. They hadn't contacted me. They hadn't spoken. But I had seen them, and I had watched them study our world. The unknown had revealed itself, but not to me, not directly. I wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. The stars still shine brightly above me every time I look up. I wonder if they're out there, waiting, watching. Maybe one day they'll return. Or maybe they've already found others who are ready to understand. Whatever the truth is, I know this: we are not alone.
It was supposed to be a simple getaway. Just me, Mia, Josh, and David. 4 friends looking to escape work, city noise, and stress. Mia found the listing for the cabin online. It was isolated, tucked deep into the mountains, and dirt cheap. Too cheap, honestly. Probably just because it's so far out, Mia had reasoned. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. People don't want that. We wanted that. A weekend off the grid, sitting by the fire, playing cards, drinking whiskey under the stars. It sounded perfect. The drive was long. The last hour was just winding dirt roads, barely wide enough for the car. Trees pressed in on either side, tall and lifeless in the winter cold. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin was older than we expected. Wooden, 2 stories, with a sagging porch and dark windows that reflected nothing. There was a shed out back, half collapsed, leaning awkwardly to one side. Inside, it was cozy enough. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, a small kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. Everything was clean. The furniture looked barely used. But the place had a strange stillness, like it had been waiting for us. And when I set my bags down in the bedroom, I could have sworn I heard footsteps upstairs. I told myself it was just the house settling. That night, we drank, played poker, and told ghost stories. trying to one-up each other. The only thing scaring us was how bad Josh was at bluffing. By midnight, we were tipsy and laughing, the nervous feeling I'd had before completely forgotten. Then Mia stopped laughing. She cocked her head to the side. "Did you hear that?" We all fell silent. There was nothing but the crackling fire, the wind outside. "Hear what?" Josh asked. Mia's brows furrowed. "I don't know. I thought I heard someone talking." We listened. Nothing. David grinned. "The ghosts are already getting to you." Mia didn't laugh. Neither did I. Eventually, we went to bed. My room was upstairs, and as I climbed the creaky wooden steps, I felt this pressure in the air, like something was watching. Like something didn't want me there. But when I checked the hallway, it was empty. Just my imagination, I told myself. The second evening, David and I went outside to grab more firewood. The air was sharp against my lungs, cold enough that my breath hung in the air like smoke. That's when David grabbed my arm. "There." He pointed into the trees. I followed his gaze. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, between the dark trunks just past the tree line, I saw it. A figure, standing still, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just that it was tall, unmoving. "Maybe a hunter?" I whispered. But my voice didn't sound right. I didn't believe it. Neither did David. "Let's go," he muttered, and we hurried back inside. We locked the door and told Mia and Josh what we'd seen. Josh peered out the window. "Could have been a tree." "It wasn't a tree," David said. Mia was quiet, arms wrapped around herself. "I told you I heard someone." None of us slept well that night. I woke up around 3 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The others were asleep, their slow breathing the only sound. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Quiet. Intentional. Just outside the cabin. I stopped breathing, focusing intently on the sound. Whoever it was wasn't walking away. They were pacing, back and forth. Slow, heavy steps across the wooden porch. Then, tap, tap, tap. On the front door. Not loud, not frantic. Just 3 slow, steady taps. I wanted to wake the others, but something told me not to move, not to make a sound. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours. Then they stopped. I spent the rest of the night wide awake. In the morning, I told the others. David and I went outside to check the snow. Sure enough, there were footprints on the porch. But what made my stomach drop was that they didn't lead up to the cabin. There were no approach tracks. No sign of anyone coming from the woods. The footprints started at our door, and they only led away. We packed up within the hour. We didn't talk much on the drive home. No one wanted to say what we were all thinking, that it wasn't just some hunter, that the footprints shouldn't have been possible, that we had let something in. I went back to my normal life, or at least I tried to. I convinced myself it was just a weird experience, a coincidence, something explainable. After returning home, I kept waking up at 3 a.m., my heart racing, to the same slow, deliberate taps at my window. 3 taps, too precise to be the wind, too high for anyone to reach. At first I tried ignoring it, pulling the covers over my head like I could hide from it. But the taps always came. 3 taps, always knowing. I wasn't the only one. Mia called first. "I can't sleep," she whispered, her voice shaky. "It's been happening every night, 3 taps. Just like you said, at my window. I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw it, in the reflection of my TV. A figure, just standing there, behind me. But when I turn around, nothing. Nothing at all." My stomach sank, because I'd started seeing it too. Not in reflections, but in the shadows. Always too tall, too still. Watching. Waiting. David called next. "I heard it again," he said, his voice tight. "The taps. 3 at my window. But when I looked, there was nothing there. I swear, I saw something standing across the street. Just standing, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. And then Josh. It's not just the taps," he said, panic creeping into his voice. It's like something standing at my window, every night. I can't explain it, but I swear I see a figure watching me, just standing there, not moving. And the taps, 3 every time. None of us were sleeping. None of us felt safe. And that's when Mia suggested the medium. Her name was Evelyn. She lived 2 towns over, in a small house packed with dusty books and the scent of burning sage. She didn't ask us many questions, just listened as we spilled everything. The cabin, the footprints, the knocks, the shadows. When we finished, she was silent for a long time, fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "You brought something back with you." Josh scoffed. "That's ridiculous. We didn't touch anything. We didn't take anything." Evelyn shook her head. "It's not about objects. Some places hold echoes of things that were. Sometimes they latch on. Follow. Because you saw it. Acknowledged it." Mia swallowed hard. "Then how do we get rid of it?" Evelyn's eyes were dark, unreadable. "You have to go back." The room went silent. "No way," David muttered. "Absolutely not." But Evelyn leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You don't understand. That cabin, it's not just haunted. It's a threshold. Something lingers there waiting. It let you leave once, but now it wants you to return." I felt ice crawl up my spine. Josh forced a laugh. "Yeah, that sounds like a great way to get murdered." Evelyn's gaze was steady. "You don't have a choice." Her next words made my hands tremble. "If you don't go back and sever the connection, it will keep following you, and it will get stronger." None of us spoke. None of us breathed. Then Mia exhaled shakily. "What happens if we do go back?" Evelyn hesitated. "That depends on whether it lets you leave a second time." Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "You need to perform a ritual to close the door," she said. "You'll need salt, sage, and candles. Most importantly, you'll need to stand together. You can't separate. If you do, it will take advantage of your fear, your weakness. This thing feeds on your fear." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. Then she continued, her voice low but unwavering. "The words you'll speak are simple, but they carry power. You'll need to say this, together, while you perform the ritual." She locked eyes with each of us in turn. "You will say, 'We close this door. We sever this bond. We are not your prey. We are not your home.'" Evelyn's gaze softened for a moment before hardening again. "You'll need to say it 3 times. 3 times, and the connection will begin to break. But be warned, you must hold strong. You must stay united. If you falter, it will grow stronger, and it won't let go easily." The room felt colder as she spoke, and the chill settled deep in my bones. She gave us one final resolute look. "Once you've spoken those words 3 times, the bond will be severed. But be ready. It will test you. It will use everything it can to weaken you. But if you stay together and say those words, if you stay firm in your belief, you will close the door. You will sever the bond." We were silent for a long moment, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to process what she had just said. A ritual, facing whatever was in the cabin. It was all so surreal. The thought of returning there, to that dark place, filled me with dread. But what other choice did we have? We couldn't keep running. David finally spoke, his voice tight. When do we leave? Evelyn stood, walking to the small table near the window, and began to gather the things we'd need. Bundles of sage, small bowls of salt, candles. "You leave when you're ready," she said, her voice calm. "But remember, don't go alone. Don't leave each other's side, not even for a second." The gravity of her words hung over us. We nodded, knowing we had no choice but to follow through. The night before we left, none of us could sleep. The reality of what was coming set in, and every creak in the house, every rustle in the dark, seemed amplified. We packed the items Evelyn had given us: salt, sage, candles, flashlights, everything we needed to prepare for what was coming. My mind kept returning to the cabin, to the oppressive feeling of being watched, to the way the figure had stood just beyond the tree line, unmoving, waiting. The next morning, we piled into David's truck. The drive felt different now, as though the air itself had changed. The road out of town seemed longer, the trees taller, the sky grayer. As we left the familiarity of the city behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were entering a place we had no business being. The drive was quiet, too quiet. We passed the familiar landmarks, the places where we had once felt safe, but now everything seemed ominous. The road narrowed as we entered the mountains, the asphalt fading into gravel, the trees on either side growing closer, thicker. The silence was suffocating, and each mile felt like a countdown. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the road, and that's when we saw it. In the distance, the cabin. There it was, nestled between the trees, its rotting exterior blending into the forest like a malignant presence. The porch sagged even more than it had before, the windows dark and lifeless. The closer we got, the more I felt the air grow thick, like the place itself was drawing us in, like it had been waiting for us to return. David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "There it is," he muttered, his voice tight with dread. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The cabin loomed in front of us, growing larger with every passing second. It felt like the forest itself was closing in, as if the trees were leaning in, pressing us toward the house. The weight of it all was unbearable, and for a moment, I almost wished we could turn back. But we couldn't. We were already here. We were almost there, and we had to face whatever was waiting for us inside. This was the point of no return. David stopped the truck, but no one moved right away. We all stared at the cabin, its dark silhouette surrounded by the twisted trees that seemed to form a barrier, a wall between us and the rest of the world. For a moment, I wondered if we could still leave. But the thought was fleeting. Evelyn's words echoed in my mind. "You can't separate. It will feed on your fear. Stay together. Stay strong." "I can't do this," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible, but her words were clear. I turned to her, but there was nothing I could say. Nothing could prepare us for what was to come. "We have to," I said, my voice hoarse, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's the only way." David exhaled sharply, slamming the truck door with a force that made us all jump. "Let's get this over with." The cabin greeted us with a silence so deep it felt wrong. The world outside seemed to fade, and for a moment I could have sworn the air itself held its breath. Every step we took toward the porch seemed to echo too loudly, our footfalls reverberating in the stillness. As we approached the door, the weight of the task ahead began to feel unbearable. The cabin loomed in front of us like an ancient beast. David reached for the door handle, but he hesitated, his hand hovering over it. "I've never felt something like this before," he muttered. "It's not right." Mia's breath hitched as she stepped closer, almost instinctively grabbing my arm. "What if we can't do it? What if we fail?" "We won't fail," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. We have the ritual. We have each other. It will work. We just have to stay together. We can't. Before I could finish, the door creaked open on its own. The air inside the cabin felt thicker, colder, and the scent of mildew and decay hit us like a physical force. I stepped inside, the others close behind. The faint light from the dying day struggled to filter through the grimy windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe. "Salt," David said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "Mia, you're in charge of that." Mia nodded, her face pale, and started to pour the salt into a careful circle on the floor. The grains scattered with a soft hiss, each one a tiny marker of the boundary we were about to create. David set the candles in a precise circle around the salt, the small flames flickering weakly, almost as if the house itself was resisting the light. The air inside was thick, and the silence seemed to press against us, suffocating, until I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and unyielding. I took the sage from the bag Evelyn had given us and struck a match. The flame flared for a second before I held it to the dried leaves, watching them catch fire. The smoke rose, curling and twisting, dark and pungent. I began to move around the circle, holding the sage high, the smoke swirling in the air like a living thing. My chest felt tight and my breath shallow. Once we were all inside the circle, we stood together, close, not daring to separate, even for a second. The weight of the moment was crushing. We knew what we had to do, but I could feel my hands shaking as I spoke the words Evelyn had taught us. We close this door. We sever this bond. We are not your prey. We are not your home. The words hung in the air, heavy and unnatural. It felt as if the house itself recoiled at the sound. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I shuddered. Something was watching us. David was the first to speak again, his voice low but filled with urgency. "We have to say it again. It won't stop unless we do." I nodded, swallowing hard. I could feel the pressure building, the tension coiling tighter inside the room. We close this door. We sever this bond. We are not your prey. We are not your home. The moment we spoke the final word, the room trembled. The air crackled with a violent energy, like static before a storm. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing as if pushed by unseen forces. I could hear something, faint at first, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls. And then I saw it. The figure, the same dark silhouette from before, standing just beyond the edge of the circle, its form shifting and stretching, impossible to focus on. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place. Mia gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "It's here! It's not going to let us leave!" I felt the weight of its gaze, like cold fingers pressing against my skin. The house seemed to groan, the walls bending and warping, as if the very structure of the place was alive and resisting us. David's voice cracked as he spoke again. "We have to finish it, together. We have to say it one last time." I forced myself to breathe, my chest tight with fear. The ritual was all we had left. We had to complete it. With shaking voices, we all spoke together, louder this time, as the growling outside grew into a deafening roar. The temperature dropped further, the candles barely clinging to their flames. "We close this door. We sever this bond. We are not your prey. We are not your home." The room erupted. A force, cold and violent, slammed into us, the very walls shaking with the power of it. The candles flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed to claw at us, reaching for us, but we held our ground. The air felt as though it was being sucked out of the room, a suffocating force pulling at us from all sides. The figure outside, no longer just a shadow, but something more, was there, pressing against the circle, its presence undeniable, its hunger palpable. Then, with a final, desperate surge of energy, the figure lunged forward. But as it did, something inside me snapped. A surge of raw, untamed power pulsed through the room. The ground trembled as the figure was forced back, something invisible pulling it away from us. The air cleared. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the cold began to recede. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. We were shaking, our bodies trembling with the aftershock. The ritual had worked, but at a cost. The house was silent. The figure was gone. But something inside me told me it wasn't over. Not yet. Not completely. We had closed the door, but it was only a matter of time before it tried to open again. The truck rumbled down the mountain road, the air thick with the silence that had followed us from the cabin. We had done it. We had completed the ritual, closed the door, and severed the bond. But the weight of what had happened still pressed down on us, heavy and unspoken. David's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But I could feel the tension in his every movement. Mia sat beside me, her gaze unfocused, staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. None of us had spoken since we left the cabin. What could we say? As we neared the town, the world seemed to return to its normal rhythm. The streets, the buildings, the people, all of it felt distant now. Like we had stepped out of a nightmare and into the bright light of day, though I knew we were still carrying the shadow of what we had faced. The mundane chatter of the radio seemed so foreign in the wake of everything. "Do you think it's really over?" Mia finally asked, her voice small. But the question hung in the air like a weight. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to believe it, to feel the relief that should have followed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. David exhaled sharply. "It has to be. It's over. We did what we had to do." We didn't speak again until we pulled up to our houses. The familiar sight of my driveway felt strangely comforting. The world felt normal, just as it had before, as if nothing had changed. But we all knew it had. For the next few weeks, life fell back into its usual routine. School, work, the little things that made up our days. But no matter how normal it seemed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. That something was lingering just outside the edges of my vision.
The forest always felt like a sanctuary for me, a place to escape the chaos of life and just breathe. But tonight, something felt different. The usual stillness of the woods was missing. The air was thick with humidity, pressing down on me, and the usual chorus of birds and rustling animals was absent. It was as if the forest had gone completely silent. I tried to shake off the discomfort, but it lingered. The moon barely filtered through the dense canopy above, leaving the ground in shadows. My flashlight cast an erratic beam through the trees, struggling to break through the darkness. I walked a little faster, brushing away the creeping sense of unease. Maybe I was just overthinking it. A little rustle in the bushes or the wind, nothing more. But then, I heard it. A faint clicking noise. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't just the usual rustling of animals. It was different, sharp, almost rhythmic. I tilted my head, straining my ears, and sure enough, it came again. Closer this time. I looked up, but all I could see was the dark shape of branches overhead, tangled and thick. The sound came from above me, moving between the trees, quick and deliberate. A shiver ran down my spine, and I took a step back. What was that? My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was an owl or a raccoon, something harmless. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The air felt heavier now, pressing against me, and the forest seemed to be watching. The clicking continued, each snap of a branch or rustle in the leaves making me jump. Something was up there. I wasn't alone. I took another step forward, trying to ignore the panic rising in my chest. Then the sound came again, closer this time, louder. The unmistakable crack of something jumping from tree to tree. It was fast, too fast, and the sound felt wrong. It wasn't the movement of a normal animal. I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight trembling in my hand. My breath hitched as I scanned the shadows, hoping to see something, anything to explain the noise. But all I saw were the thick trunks of trees, their dark shapes looming like silent sentinels. The clicking came again, louder now. It was circling me, leaping from one tree to the next with unnerving precision. I could feel it, even though I couldn't see it. Whatever it was up there, watching. I couldn't stay still. I had to move. My heart pounded in my chest as my legs began to carry me forward, though I had no clear direction. The flashlight's beam bounced over the underbrush as I pushed through the trees trying to get away, but it felt like the forest was closing in on me. I wasn't just lost in the woods. I was being hunted. The sounds from above continued, rapid clicking growing louder with each passing moment. It was toying with me. I could feel it, moving through the trees, never showing itself. Always just out of sight, just behind the shadows. I dared to look up again, even though every part of me screamed not to. And then I saw them. Two bright blue eyes glowing faintly, locked onto me from the darkness. They were unnaturally vibrant against the blackness of the trees, cold and unblinking. My breath caught in my throat and I took a step back. It was watching me. Its form was barely visible in the shadows, sitting perfectly still on a branch just above me. Its body was a dark, mottled green, slick and slightly scaled. The light from my flashlight shimmered across its skin, revealing long, sharp spikes that ran down its spine, sharp and jagged like a crown of thorns. Its limbs were long and spindly, like a spider's, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers that curled tightly around the branch it was perched upon. But what really caught my attention were its wings, small and malformed, barely larger than a human hand. They were too tiny to ever lift the creature from the ground, but the way they twitched made me think they were more for show than function. The creature didn't move. It simply sat there, perched in the tree, watching me with those unblinking blue eyes, glowing in the darkness. The air around me grew colder and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I was paralyzed by its gaze, unable to move or even breathe. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves overhead, but that too seemed to stop when the creature's focus was entirely on me. Why wasn't it attacking? It was so still, almost unreal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calculating something, waiting for the right moment. Its body was rigid, its small wings twitching ever so slightly, and I could feel its presence weighing heavily on the air around me. When I finally tore my eyes away and forced myself to run, my body was heavy, sluggish, like my legs had turned to stone. My heart thundered in my chest as I crashed through the trees, branches scraping at my face and arms. The forest seemed endless, and I could hear the creature's movements above me again. The sharp clicks, the low thud of its body landing on the branches, echoing just above me. I didn't stop running, not until I broke through the trees and emerged into the clearing near my house. Gasping for breath, my body trembling, I didn't dare look back. The moon bathed the area in an eerie light, and the forest was still again. Too still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still there, lurking in the trees.
I moved into my house on a quiet autumn afternoon, unloading boxes and trying to ignore the unsettling stillness inside. The house had been empty for years before I bought it, and there was something about the silence that felt unnatural. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden floors groaned beneath my every step. That first night, as I lay in bed exhausted from unpacking, I heard it. The distant sound of a dog barking. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling trees outside. I figured a neighbor's dog must have been left out for the night and thought little of it. But as the days passed, the barking didn't stop. It grew more persistent, always just on the edge of my hearing. Sometimes it was a single, sharp bark. Other times, it was a low, drawn-out howl that sent shivers down my spine. I started paying closer attention. Every time I heard the barking, I would look out my windows, searching for the source. But there was never a dog in sight. The yard was empty, the street was still, even the leaves barely stirred. One evening, just before dusk, the barking came again, this time closer. I stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around me as I scanned the yard. The sky was streaked with the last remnants of daylight, casting long shadows across the grass. That's when I saw it. A large white dog sat at the far end of the property, near the old wooden fence. The dog didn't move. It simply stared at me, its dark eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Hey, buddy," I called softly, taking a cautious step forward. The dog stood, its movements smooth and silent. Without a sound, it turned and trotted toward the back corner of the yard, where a cluster of trees cast deep shadows over the grass. I followed, my heartbeat quickening. When I got closer, the dog paused and turned to face me again. For a moment, we simply watched each other. Then, slowly, its tail gave the smallest of wags, gentle, almost hesitant, like a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't excitement, nor was it fear. It felt like recognition, as if, in that brief moment, it had accepted my presence. And then it was gone. There was nowhere for it to have gone. Not through the fence, not behind a tree. It had simply vanished. That night, I couldn't shake the unease curling in my stomach. I barely slept, jolted awake by the phantom barking that now seemed to echo inside the house itself. The next morning, I decided to ask my neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades. "Oh," she said, nodding knowingly. "You saw the shepherd, didn't you?" I hesitated. "The white dog?" She smiled sadly. "That house used to belong to an old couple, the Parkers, sweet folks. They had a beautiful white shepherd, smart as a whip, always watching over them. When they passed, the dog stayed, waiting for them to come home." She sighed. Poor thing wouldn't leave the porch even when the house was empty. One winter it just faded away. A chill ran down my spine. "So, people have seen it before?" I asked. She nodded. "Every now and then, not everyone, just certain people. I guess he's still looking after the place." That night, as I settled into bed, I heard the barking again. Closer this time, right outside my window. But now, instead of fear, I felt something else. Not every spirit lingers with malice. Some remain out of loyalty. Even in death, the watchdog still stood guard.
I've spent most of my life working as a night manager at a small motel off Highway 27. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. And after years of dealing with drunks, runaways, and the occasional drug deal gone wrong, I thought I had seen it all. That was, of course, before I ever set foot in room 209. The motel was old, built sometime in the 1960s, and had its fair share of creepy occurrences, doors shutting on their own, the occasional cold spot, even lights flickering. But room 209, that was different. No one ever stayed in room 209. It wasn't on purpose. It just always seemed to be vacant. If someone booked it online, they'd call to cancel before they arrived. If I tried to check someone in, the system would crash, or the key card wouldn't work. It was as if the room wanted to stay empty. One night, that changed. It was a slow Tuesday, and I was the only one on shift. The motel was nearly empty, except for a couple of truckers and an older man passing through. Around 2:30 a.m., I was sipping my coffee when the phone rang. "Front desk," I answered. At first, there was silence. Then a faint crackling sound like static. "Hello?" Then I heard it. A voice, low, distorted and whispering. "Help. Me." I sat up straight. "Sir? Ma'am? Who is this?" The static grew louder, then cut off completely. I looked down at the caller ID. The call had come from room 209. My blood ran cold. That room was supposed to be empty. I checked the system. No one had been checked into 209 for over a month. I grabbed the master key and a flashlight, then made my way down the dimly lit corridor. The carpet was musty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. As I approached the door, I hesitated. Something about the air felt wrong. Heavy, like the room was holding its breath. I knocked. "Hello? This is the front desk. I got a call from this room. Do you need assistance?" Silence. I swiped the key card and pushed the door open. The room was freezing. The air conditioner wasn't running, but my breath was visible. The bed was made just as housekeeping had left it. The TV was on, but only static filled the screen. The phone sat on the nightstand, the receiver slightly off the hook. And then I noticed the bathroom door. It was open just a crack. I swallowed hard. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but something compelled me forward. Slowly, I reached out and pushed the door open. Nothing. Just an empty bathroom. The shower curtain was drawn closed, but I could see there was no one behind it. Then, a breath. Not mine. Right next to my ear. I spun around, heart hammering. The room was still empty. But when I looked at the mirror above the sink, my stomach dropped. There was something behind me. A shadow. Tall. Thin. Featureless. It stood in the corner of the room, just beyond my reflection, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. Then, in the mirror, I saw its head snap toward me. The lights flickered. The TV cut out. And in a voice barely above a whisper, I heard it say, "I've been waiting for this." I didn't stop to think. I ran. Out of the room, down the hallway, all the way back to the front desk. I locked the office door behind me and sat there until sunrise, gripping my coffee cup with shaking hands. The next morning, I checked the security footage. The hallway camera showed me walking into room 209. A few seconds later, the lights in the room flickered wildly. Then the door slammed shut on its own. I didn't remember that happening. But what chilled me to the bone was the last frame before I ran out. The shadow. Standing just inside the doorway, watching me leave. I don't know what's in room 209, and I don't want to. After that night, I blocked it from the system. No one stays there anymore. If a guest asks about it, I just shake my head and say it's out of order, because some doors should never be opened.
The swamp is different at dusk. It breathes. The air is thick with moisture, curling against my skin, heavy with the sense of wet earth and decaying leaves. The trees stand tall and gnarled, their roots twisting through the shallow water like skeletal fingers. Fireflies bob lazily in the dim light, their glow flickering between the moss-draped branches. I step carefully, my boots sinking into the soft mud, careful not to lose my footing. I shouldn't have gone so deep into the swamp. I remind myself of this every time. Grandmother needs the pennyroyal to make the remedies that have kept us all healthy for years. I can't let her down. She uses it for everything: fevers, colds, and the aches in her joints when the weather changes. Pennyroyal oil, extracted from the leaves of the plant, is her go-to for its soothing properties. Sometimes she brews it into tea to ease discomfort. It's a remedy that has kept our family healthy for as long as I can remember. So I offered to go. The best pennyroyal grows deep in the swamp where the land is still wild, untouched. That's what Grandmother always says. She used to gather it herself when she was younger, before the wear of time made her body too slow and weary to venture this deep into the swamp. I promised her I'd be back before dark. The mist is creeping in, rolling low over the water in thick white tendrils. It pools around the cypress trees, curling along the ground, swallowing everything past a few feet. I crouch, plucking a sprig of pennyroyal, rubbing the leaves between my fingers. The sharp scent fills my nose, grounding me. I should turn back now. I have enough. But just as I reach for another, I hear it. A voice. Amelia. I froze for a moment. The word is swallowed by the mist, distant like it's drifting through water. My breath catches in my throat. It sounds like my brother. But Isaac is home, miles away, bundled in blankets by the fire. I left him there. I know I did. The cicadas have gone silent. Come look at this. The voice is further now, deeper in the swamp. It's gentle, almost curious, like Isaac found something he wants to show me. But it isn't him. My hands tighten into fists. I didn't move. Something shifts in the mist. A dark shape, far beyond the trees. My breath is shallow, heart hammering against my ribs as I forced myself to look. In the water, on a half-sunken rock, a silhouette rests. A woman. She sits with her back to me, her long, dark hair flowing down her back. Her skin is unnaturally pale, almost glowing against the murky water. She's motionless, unnervingly so, as if she has forgotten how to breathe. The mist swirls around her. The air feels wrong, thick and dense, pressing against my chest. My legs are locked in place, but every inch of me is screaming to run. A faint hum fills the air, eerie yet beautiful, like a distant lullaby woven with an unsettling undertone. It crawls under my skin, settling in my bones. My breath comes in short, shallow gasps. Amelia, I'm over here. The voice is softer now, closer, almost inside my head. The woman tilts her head ever so slightly. My stomach twists, a deep, instinctual dread settling in my gut. I take a slow step back, my boots squelching in the mud. The sound is deafening in the quiet. The woman's head snaps toward me. I don't see her face. I don't want to see her face. Then, without a sound, she moves, slipping from the rock and vanishing beneath the water. The moment she's gone, my body unfreezes. I turned and ran. The basket slips from my hand as branches lash at my arms, my feet struggling to find grip in the slick, shifting mud. My breath is ragged, my heart hammering so loudly I can barely hear anything else. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I saw the glow of Grandmother's lantern through the trees. The warmth of home flickered in the distance, a lifeline in the dark. Only then do I dare to pause, chest heaving, hands shaking. The swamp is silent. The mist remained, wrapped around the trees, swirling over the water, undulating like a living thing. I bolted the rest of the way home,